7 billion years. That's how long ago today's story goes back. Before our sun had formed, certainly before Earth had even begun to form. Somewhere in a distant corner of the oldest parts of the Milky Way, a chunk of rock was flung out of its home star system and into the void of interstellar space. It drifted through the darkness for eons, past dying suns, and through stretches of total and complete nothing. That is, until this past summer, when it finally wandered into our own backyard. Within weeks, it had become the biggest astronomical event in years, not just for where or when it had come from, but for just what it might be. A leading astrophysicist looked at the accumulating evidence and went so far as to publicly declare that it was more likely than not of artificial origin. They named it 3-Eye Atlas, and for the last few months, the world has watched as scientists race to understand what's presenting itself before them before it disappears back into the void.
Just before we continue with today's episode, a quick word from our sponsor, Holzken. This time of year, gift ideas, they're either boring, they're overpriced, or possibly both. So when Holzken reached out, Holzken reached out to me a while ago. I've been working with Holzken for some time now. They reached out and they told me about some of their latest stuff. And I already know Holzken. They've been doing some great stuff for a while. I've got a couple of their wooden watches where they have the strap. This one has a beautiful leaf in there. I mean, like the structure of the leaf, you can see it's not like just a fresh leaf. Holzken makes watches and jewelry from natural materials like actual stone, wood, pearl, and stainless steel finished with gold or platinum. Ooh, I should have got one of those. I just went for this cool, black looking one. With Holzken, you're not just getting some mass-produced accessory. Each one is unique because it's made with bits of nature. Their products are handmade in small batches responsibly, and they ship from Vienna. No custom hassles for the US, and delivery takes just 3 to 5 business days. Also, they don't just dump it in some tacky box. Each watch comes in a nice red gift pouch, and the jewelry ships in a green box. No wrapping needed. If you're buying for someone who's hard to shop for, this is one of those few gifts that actually feels personal. You're gonna love it. Order by December the 19th to guarantee delivery by Christmas. Go to holzken.com/celestium for 15% off with the code Celestium. Again, that's holzken.com/celestium. Thoughtful gift, no last minute panic. And now back to today's episode.
Out of the void. On July the 1st, 2025, a telescope in Chile's Rio Hurtado Valley, dedicated to scanning for asteroids and comets that might threaten Earth, picked up what at first glance appeared to be just another moving dot of light on their screen. The astronomers in the system gave it a generic designation and moved it into the queue for follow-up observation, just one among many. First appearances can be misleading, though, and within a matter of hours, data on this new discovery was coming back strange, especially when it came to speed. The object was clocking in at roughly 60 kilometers per second relative to the Sun, or over 200,000 kilometers per hour. To put that in perspective, Earth orbits the Sun at about 30 kilometers per second, and even Mercury, baking at the innermost orbit of the solar system, where the Sun's gravity is far more intense, moves only at 47 kilometers per second. Speed here plays a crucial role in understanding this object's relationship to our solar system. Every object in space exists in a kind of gravitational tug-of-war with whatever is nearby, and the closer you are to a large body like a star or gas giant, the faster you need to be moving in order to break free of its pull. At the distance where this new anomaly was spotted, anything moving faster than 18 kilometers per second would be in the escape velocity category. At 3 times this speed, this new discovery was clearly something else entirely. That's one of the fastest incoming speeds ever recorded for an object entering our solar system, and it meant that the trajectory was hyperbolic, a term used to describe when something is moving fast enough that the sun's gravity would never be able to hold onto it regardless of how close it got. The Discovery team knew that this wasn't just another rock floating in space. They were clearly sitting on something quite significant. So they sent out an alert through the International Astronomical Union's system, notifying scientists, observatories, and governments alike throughout the world of their discovery. Within a few days, telescopes on multiple continents were rotating into position. They were joined by some of the most sophisticated imagery equipment that we have in space too. The Hubble and James Webb telescopes were both redirected to observe it. The early estimates of its size immediately raised eyebrows. Based on how bright it appeared to be at that distance, some calculations suggested that the object might be absolutely enormous, potentially 10 to 20 kilometers across. Just for context, that's the entire length of Manhattan measured from north to south. One estimate put it at double that figure, suggesting it could be as large as 46 kilometers. The combination was unusual enough that the teams who joined the research early on knew that this had to be something from beyond our solar system. For those unfamiliar with why any of this is such a big deal, it does help to understand just how empty the space between stars actually is. Our own solar system contains an enormous amount of stuff, not just the 8 planets, but 891 moons, over 1 million asteroids, and countless smaller chunks of rock and ice, all of which are bound by the sun's gravity. Other systems have their own collections, similarly gravitationally bound to their star. But in between those systems, there's not much to speak of. Solar system's gravitational pull keeps things in essentially closed systems for the most part. While scientists had long theorized that interstellar debris had to exist given that certain celestial events like planet formations or particularly violent collisions would necessarily shoot some objects into the void, until quite recently, they had no actual evidence for it. That was until 2017 and the discovery of the very first object, which later became known as Oumuamua. Technology up to that point simply wasn't sophisticated enough to detect previous cases, and even here, we only barely caught it. By the time anyone noticed the comet, Oumuamua had already made its way into our solar system, swung past the sun, and was well on its way back out into interstellar space, making for a painfully short window of observation. Even with what little data we were able to capture on it, though, it was coming back weird. The object was bizarrely shaped, oddly elongated, making it appear to be something equivalent of a cosmic cigar. It appeared to neither have a comma around it, nor a tail trailing it, which was very atypical for an object that had just passed by the sun. But most surprising of all was that it exhibited a slight acceleration as it moved away from the sun that couldn't be fully explained by gravity or solar radiation pressure alone. Something was giving it a tiny but measurable push, and nobody could definitively say what, naturally leading to theories that attempted to fill in the gaps. The most common scientific explanation, albeit the least exciting, was outgassing or vaporizing ice, creating a small rocket effect as it was jettisoned into space. This still had issues, though, given the lack of observable comma. Others were more provocative, such as when the now famous Harvard astrophysicist Avi Loeb proposed in 2018 that Oumuamua might not have been merely a comet, but rather an alien light sail, an artifact of extraterrestrial technology being pushed through space by solar radiation. The second interstellar object we discovered, 2I Borisov, showed up 2 years later and had its own quirks, although they were less extreme. Spectroscopic analysis, which identifies chemicals by the light they emit, revealed it contained far more carbon monoxide than typical comets from our solar system, once again pointing to the notion that the composition of objects is far from uniform throughout the galaxy. The carbon monoxide issues aside, though, Borisov was almost reassuringly normal. It had a proper comet, a visible tail, and followed a trajectory that matched gravitational predictions without any mysterious acceleration that couldn't be explained by standard outgassing as the frozen comet warmed. If nothing else, Borisov demonstrated that not everything from interstellar space was going to be as baffling as Oumuamua. And that brings us back to our current visitor, the third interstellar object we've detected, hence the name 3I and Atlas for the observatory that found it. And it is, by far, the most unusual one of the lot. When the data from the James Webb Telescope came back, scientists were even more surprised by the composition of what was coming off the comet. Nearly 80% of the material was carbon dioxide mixed with only trace amounts of water vapor. This is essentially backwards from every comet in our own solar system, where water ice typically dominates. When comets heat up as they approach the sun, it's usually water that sublimates first and creates the comet tail. So for an object to be venting mostly carbon dioxide was genuinely strange, and scientists still aren't entirely sure why. One possibility is that it formed in an exceptionally cold region of its home system, far beyond the point where water ice would dominate, in a zone where CO2 was the primary frozen material. Another possibility is that the eons it has spent traveling through empty space had slowly transformed its outer layers, breaking apart water molecules and leaving behind a carbon dioxide-heavy outer shell. There were also readings that didn't match anything we'd seen before, especially in terms of metals. The Very Large Telescope in Chile, we're not giving them any bonus points for their creativity in naming things here, detected nickel vapor, which isn't unusual on its own. What was highly unusual, though, was the low ratio of iron detected along with it. In every comet we've studied, these two metals appear together. They sublimate at similar temperatures, so when a comet gets warm enough to begin releasing one, it's usually done alongside the other. Astronomers have been able to trace 3I Atlas's trajectory back over the last 4 million years, a painstaking process that involved modeling not just where the object had been, as if drawing a straight line through the cosmos, but accounting for any stars or systems that it may have encountered along the way and how those would have impacted its trajectory. And given just how old this comet was believed to have been, it would have to take into account not just the systems that are here right now, but also the stars that have since gone dark. Once completed, they concluded that the comet likely originated from the direction of the galactic core, and modeling its path through the Milky Way suggested it came from the Thick Disk, which is a group of star systems that orbit both above and below the galaxy's main plane. These are some of the most ancient stars, most of which formed when the universe was still relatively young and as the Milky Way was still taking shape. If true, this was a whole different type of visitor than we had been expecting. It was a relic from a far, far distant past that we've never been able to study up close and might never get the opportunity to study again. One study from Oxford astronomer Matthew Hopkins estimated that the comet could be over 7 billion years old. The precious little time had passed before a very different interpretation of what 3I Atlas might be started to capture people's attention and curiosity. The Harvard astronomer. It did not take long for someone to look at those strange features of whatever this object was and ask a different kind of question. Within 2 weeks of the discovery, R.V. Loeb, the same Harvard astrophysicist who suggested that Oumuamua might have been alien technology, was making the case that 3I Atlas deserved the same consideration when he published a blog titled "Is the Interstellar Object 3I Atlas Alien Technology?" Credit where it's due, Loeb is not some fringe figure or a conspiracy theorist. Far from it. He is the former chair of Harvard's astronomy department, has published hundreds of peer-reviewed papers, and is a genuinely accomplished scientist. He also seems to have a flair for the dramatic. His case began with the trajectory and the backwards mapping that had traced where this comet had come from. Loeb looked at the data and saw something troubling. During the millions of years they traced its trajectory back through, they were able to identify 93 separate stars and systems it would have passed by along its journey. Given the vast stretches of pure nothingness in space, astronomers have come up with various units of measurement to help make sense of the distances. An astronomical unit, or AU, is roughly the distance between Earth and the Sun. A light year is about 63,000 of those units. Throughout 3I Atlas's journey past those 93 stars, the closest it ever came to any of them was about 1 light year. But our system? After all those millions of years, it would ultimately come within just 1.4 AU of our Sun. And that is just the start of what captivated so many about this object. There's also the trajectory alignment issue. Remember, despite the flat models of the solar system and galaxy that we're used to seeing, space is three-dimensional and can carry on in any direction. It's only because of the gravitational force of our Sun, combined with the speed with which the planets are moving relative to it, that hold things together on a relatively flat plane. But our system itself isn't flat within the galaxy. We're tilted at about a 60-degree angle relative to the flat disk appearance of the Milky Way. Despite this slope, 3I Atlas has essentially hit us dead on in terms of passing through nearly all of our solar system in perfect alignment with the plane on which our planets orbit. Loeb calculated the odds of that happening by mere chance at roughly 0.2%. And it wasn't just the alignment itself, the timing was suspicious on several fronts. The comet arrived precisely timed to take it within close proximity to the rocky inner planets of our solar system. It would pass Mars, then Venus, and after coming around the Sun, it would partially bypass Earth at a distance of 1.8 AU, nearly twice the distance from the Sun. These didn't seem to be random either. It would pass close enough to be observed, but stay far enough away to both avoid posing a threat and being captured in detail in high resolution. Even the phase when it would pass closest to the Sun, which is known as perihelion, was suspicious in terms of timing. Comets are usually at their most active during this point, given that they're being exposed to the most intense solar radiation they've experienced in potentially millions of years. Yet when 3I Atlas was at perihelion, Earth was positioned on the exact opposite side of our star, effectively blinding us to it at the most interesting moment when the comet would be at its peak activity. Put all of these anomalies together, and for R.V. Loeb at least, the argument that this was merely a comet was becoming harder to accept. By this point, he had firmly established himself as the leading proponent that it could be of artificial origin. He even created the Loeb scale, a ranking system from 0 to 10 for how likely an interstellar object was to be artificial, and he put 3I Atlas at a 6. Keep in mind that in the scientific world, anything higher than an 8 would be seen as a wild coincidence, and he was saying that it was more likely than not that this object was not, in fact, a comet, but rather an alien creation. He has since walked that back and scaled it down to a 4, but the original ranking made waves on the internet. Kim Kardashian even chimed in, posting a tweet asking, "Wait, what's the T on 3i Atlas? ? Exclamation mark, question mark." And look, we never thought we'd be discussing Kim Kardashian here on Celestium, but here we are. Suffice it to say that by this point, the whole situation had captured the attention of the world. Elon Musk and Avi Loeb both went on Joe Rogan's show to discuss the matter, each getting millions of views. But this was just the beginning, given that by the time 3i Atlas was approaching its closest pass by Mars, the United States government entered a shutdown. This is more of a recurring political dysfunction in Washington rather than an international cover-up, but the optics were nevertheless quite bad. Because of a legal technicality, NASA, along with other federal agencies, were legally required to cease most non-essential operations, which includes public communications. Anticipation had been building for quite some time for this moment. 3i Atlas would come far closer to Mars than it would to Earth, and we were relatively well positioned for the opportunity. There's quite a bit of technology, both on and orbiting around the red planet now, which was to be repurposed to get some images of the comet. Even though none of them were set to be taking images of fast-moving, still relatively far-away comets, people were hopeful that we could get a better look at it. NASA's HiRISE camera on the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, the most powerful telescope in the Mars system, was in place and captured what everyone had hoped would be the definitive images. On the ground, the Perseverance rover joined in too, photographing 3i Atlas as it streaked across the sky. And all of this was stuck behind a bureaucratic wall. The collection process largely wasn't impacted, but NASA was prohibited from releasing just about anything on the subject for over a month, making for the longest shutdown in US history. On some level, you can't fault people for jumping to conclusions given this setup. Here was an object that a Harvard professor had publicly stated was more likely than not to be alien technology, and the images captured from it simply couldn't be released. Social media was filled with claims that NASA was hiding something or that the shutdown was deliberately timed, but it extended far beyond platforms like X. Representative Anna Paulina Luna, a Republican congresswoman from Florida, sent a formal letter to the space agency demanding they release the images, though this didn't go very far as their hands were simply tied by Congress's inaction. AI-generated deepfakes of well-known scientists like Michiel Kaku and Brian Cox making alarming statements about the comet only further fanned the flames. The fake videos showed them claiming that the comet was, in fact, an alien vessel and that international governments were hiding the truth, and a few even warned of something akin to the end times. None of it was real, of course, but plenty of people did fall for it. Comets, however, wait for no man or government, and 3i Atlas kept hurtling through space while everybody back on Earth waited for answers. What we're actually seeing. By the time the government shutdown ended on November the 12th, 3i Atlas had already completed perihelion and swung around the sun and was heading back out towards interstellar space. It had survived the process, having shed perhaps 10% of its mass, but it was intact. It ultimately took NASA about a week after the shutdown ended to finally release the much-anticipated images, which is when that infamous "it is a comet" press conference was held. The images were not exactly what people had been expecting or hoping for, to say the least. The description of HiRISE's camera as being the highest quality in the Mars system had led to widespread expectations of ultra-high-resolution images of Comet or something else. Instead, they were completely lackluster. The images from Perseverance's camera were elongated and blurred, making it impossible to tell what was even happening. HiRISE's weren't much better. The camera had been sent there to photograph the Martian surface from orbit, not to photograph fast-moving objects tens of millions of kilometers away. NASA wasn't the only agency with eyes on the comet during the Martian pass-by either. Both the European Space Agency and China's National Space Administration had hardware in Mars' system as well. On November the 6th, Beijing released their own images captured by its Tianwen-1 orbiter. They weren't any sharper, but they showed the world what we could see. A comet surrounded by a nucleus behaving exactly as a comet should. Despite this international release of data, not everyone found NASA's anticlimactic press conference to be well-intentioned, though, nor were they particularly understanding of the technical limitations of its equipment. Avi Loeb was once again front and center in the conversation about what was really going on. It took him only a few hours to put together a blog post accusing the agency of doing little more than repeating what we already knew about it and of failing to address a set of 12 purported anomalies that he had previously published. The press conference and the images taken from the Martian system had told us nothing we didn't already know from what the Hubble and James Webb telescopes had discovered earlier in the summer. He ended by quoting none other than Sherlock Holmes, "There is nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact." Loeb's theories have only continued to evolve as new data comes in. Back in October, he had framed the perihelion phase as essentially a do-or-die moment for 3i Atlas, arguing that if the object was in fact alien technology, this would be the optimal moment for it to activate itself, given that it would be hidden from our sight behind the sun. One possibility of that activation, he reasoned, might be to release smaller probes towards various planets that it had passed along the way. He went so far as to ask whether 3i Atlas might send mini probes towards Earth as Christmas gifts for humanity. Speak for yourselves, but that wasn't quite what we had on our Christmas lists. None of that has been detected as having happened at perihelion, but that hasn't stopped the theorizing. In early December, he began arguing that the post-perihelion images depicting a teardrop-shaped glow extending in the direction of the sun were not just unusual, but potentially evidence of a swarm of smaller objects traveling alongside the comet. It's worth noting that Loeb isn't explicitly claiming that these hypothetical objects are artificial, though he is asking some rather loaded questions. Quoting, "If the antitail is indeed associated with a swarm of non-evaporating objects around 3i Atlas, the interesting question is what is the nature of these objects? Are they rocky fragments? Or something else?" End quote. He has also previously suggested that the antitail could be the object emitting a beam of light to sweep debris out of its way. Suffice it to say, the broader scientific community had largely lost patience with Loeb. Jason Wright, an astronomer who works in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, wrote a detailed series of blog posts walking through each of Loeb's claimed anomalies and explained why none of them required alien construction. Quoting, "Zero planetary scientists give RV's claims any credence." The thinly veiled frustration was understandable. This was a genuinely fascinating object, basically a time capsule from a long-since dead star system billions of years old, and the public conversation had been hijacked by speculation about not just aliens, but an alleged government conspiracy to cover up those aliens. This inadvertently sullied the name of countless scientists who had dedicated their lives to the study of space. Loeb's advocacy is best understood as a reactionary force against what he believes to be an excessively close-minded approach in the scientific community to the possibility that not only are there intelligent life forms out there in space, but they could be beginning to interact, or at the very least observe us here on Earth. In his own words, quoting, "Life is worth living if we allow for the unexpected to surprise us. Bureaucrats or unimaginative scientists want us to believe in the expected, but the rest of us know that the best is yet to come." End quote. And look, to his credit, he is correct on a number of things here. There are unexplained phenomena insofar as our current understanding of how objects in space should behave. But this can be a logical fallacy all of its own. We have to circle back to the beginning of the saga here. Oumuamua was the first example of interstellar debris that we found ever. Even with 3i Atlas, our sample size is absurdly small, literally just 3. A key component of the scientific method is that we have to be honest with ourselves and others when we do not know something, and on some of the issues that Loeb raises, we simply do not know. This is where he has received the most criticism. Fellow scientists like Neil deGrasse Tyson have accused him of essentially resurrecting the God of the Gaps model, where people who didn't know why something happened would simply chalk it up to the acts of God, except instead of God, he's swapped in aliens. Viewed through that lens, things really do start to look a lot different. It is entirely possible that the typical composition of comets in other parts of the galaxy is simply nothing like what we see here, and we don't know what normal for interstellar standards is. And if we don't know what normal for interstellar standards is, then how can we call something abnormal? That's the core problem here. Extraordinary claims, they require extraordinary proof, and as of right now, the evidence for such an object being alien is just rather lacking. Nearly all of what he points to is essentially circumstantial evidence, which isn't to say that it's not worth looking at or taking into consideration, but it has to be recognized that it is a far cry from a smoking gun or a confirmation of little green men. What Loeb typically doesn't address is just how much of 3i Atlas fits the comet explanation just fine. Once you zoom out and look at this more objectively, rather than looking exclusively at cherry-picked anomalies, the object matches predictions. It behaves as a comet should. And that's what NASA was actually saying in their November press conference, as well as before that. They weren't going on record as saying this couldn't possibly be alien technology. They were saying that all evidence points to it being a comet. That's not being closed-minded, it's evaluating the evidence they have in front of them honestly. But by that point, so much attention was drawn to some more conspiratorial approaches that assumed the worst of the agency and its workers. Basically, nothing could disprove it. NASA's very release of the images they captured was used against it as an argument that there was a conspiracy. Beyond all this, though, there's a practical problem with Loeb's alien probe theory, which he himself seems unable to answer. Whether we'd like to admit it or not, our ability to detect what's going on, even in our own solar system, isn't nearly as sophisticated as we'd like to think it is. Remember, we didn't even notice Oumuamua until it had made it through more than half of our solar system, and that was less than a decade ago. Technology has improved, certainly, but we still aren't anywhere close to the scanning technology to monitor every object out there. Loeb's hypothesis for this being an alien vessel of some kind rests heavily on the theory that in order to evade detection, they want to mask their ship's true identity by pretending to be a comet. This isn't a totally unreasonable belief. It would be natural for aliens to want to keep any intelligence-gathering operations under wraps so as not to alert those of us here on Earth. But that begs the question, why the hell would they create a ship the size of Manhattan to do it in? This isn't exactly sneaking up on someone quietly. Given our current technology, we would almost certainly miss an interstellar object if it was closer in size to what a regular ship would be. The sheer size of this object is a huge issue for such a theory, in more ways than just staying under the radar. Regardless of how advanced a species may be, it will simply take significantly more energy to get an object moving, let alone at the speed this one is. There is simply no purpose in building a vessel this large, and quite a number of reasons not to do so. Now, at the time of writing, 3I Atlas is still a visitor in our solar system. It will make its closest approach to Earth on December the 19th, though it will be much further away than it was to Mars, this time just shy of 2 astronomical units. During that pass-by, we will get one last look at this object before it heads back towards interstellar space, never to be seen again. The fact that we spent months debating whether this might be an alien spacecraft tells you something important about where we are in terms of our technological advancements. Which is to say, not nearly as far along as we'd like to believe. We've only been scanning the skies with modern equipment for a few decades, and we still haven't finished cataloguing the asteroids in our own solar system. Back in 1989, only 10,000 asteroids had been catalogued, a tiny fraction of what's out there. It wasn't until 2005 that Congress mandated NASA detect 90% of near-Earth objects larger than 140 meters across. More than 2 decades on, we're currently sitting at roughly 40% of that goal. Just this past July, an asteroid somewhere between 30 and 60 meters across passed Earth at a quarter of the distance to the Moon, and we only noticed it 2 days after it had already gone by. And that's just one system out of anywhere between 100 and 400 billion in the Milky Way alone, most of which have their own planets and their own ancient histories just waiting to be unlocked, and quite possibly other forms of intelligent life. But until we have better evidence, such possibilities remain just that. Possibilities. Thank you for watching.